been revealed that victims of the infected blood scandal will receive support scheme payments for life as part of changes to the multi-billion-pound compensation plan. And those who were subjected to unethical research will also get up to £15,000 extra, and others will also receive a social impact award. This will recognise the consequences of any stigma surrounding the disaster. And I'm joined in the studio now by GB News political correspondent Olivia Utley. Olivia, welcome to the show. A long time coming, this justice, and finally we're getting some details about the payments. Tell us more.
We are. So a very, very long time coming. This scandal took place between the 1970s and the 1990s, and it's thought that about 30,000 people were affected by it. About 3,000 people have already come forward looking for compensation. The scheme, details of the scheme have been fully announced today. The previous government, the Conservative government, committed to a serious repayment plan back in May, but there was a bit of a question mark over what would happen after the general election, because of course the election was called just a couple of weeks after that. The Labour government have now said that payments will begin to be made by the end of this year, which is what Rishi Sunak promised back in May. Individual victims could receive up to £2 million each, and the whole package is worth estimated about £10 billion. Now, that is a lot of money. It will make a very big dent in the government's budget. But, of course, there is nothing else the government could possibly do. This is one of the worst scandals, medical scandals, scandals of any kind, really, in British history. Now, there are a few more details that we know, as well as the general payout for victims and their families, because the families of those who have sadly died already will also receive payment. There are a number of people who are going to receive another fee on top of that, a £15,000 fee. Now, those are specifically men who went to, mostly men, who went to a school in Hampshire, haemophiliacs, where they were treated with this infected blood. They didn't need the blood product at all and were treated with it because they were essentially human guinea pigs for scientists trying to work out what would happen. Now, a lot of them have now died. There are some who are still living, and they will be given £15,000 on top of the regular payments. On the whole, infected blood victims seem satisfied, if satisfied can be the word in these circumstances, with the package that they're receiving. But these particular people, the ones who were experimented on, who are receiving this £15,000, have already said that they think that payment is derisory. They're not happy at all. They think it's frankly insulting. And it'll be interesting to see where the dust sort of settles on this, because it is a huge amount of money that the government is committing. But for people who have waited for so long and been treated abominably by government after government, it might just not be enough. And
the £10 billion total cost, to put in perspective, that's roughly equal to the amount it's going to cost to give the NHS workers and teachers a 5.5 pay rise. This is precisely the sort of thing that a government has to find the money for. The duty of care for a scandal that rolled on for decades, and Olivia, at the time as well, the horror of the fact often this blood was coming from prisoners in America, prisoners with drug habits who were being unscreened, and it was coming into our country, infecting people oftentimes for many, many years who had no idea what was wrong with them at the time. Well, absolutely. And as well as the obvious terrible physical impacts, and a lot of these people have now sadly died as a result of the diseases that they were infected with when they received this blood from, as you say, American prisoners, American prostitutes, blood just not being screened at all. It was at a time when Britain wasn't self-sufficient in blood, as well as the terrible physical effects. Because they weren't told about the illnesses that they were suffering, they didn't understand what was wrong with them, some of them for decades. There's one man who I was reading about who didn't find out until 2013 that he'd been infected with hepatitis. The mental health impact has been absolutely phenomenal as well. And obviously the impact on the families of these victims is huge too, which is why this package has to be quite so big. It's not just the surviving victims or even the families of those who died. It's also people who are still living, the families of those who are still living but who are in some cases disabled by their illnesses, unable to work. It's just a lot of compensation for so much time. And it's worth going back over some of the details. On the day that this was announced, on May the 20th, we had people in the studio here who've been involved in this. We also had Sir Brian Langstaff, who who chaired the inquiry, this 2,500 page report, and he said that the doctors, civil servants and ministers had closed ranks. They completely tried to squash this down. The horrifying scandal could and should have been avoided, but a catalogue of failures led to a calamity. 3,000 patients died or suffered miserably. And the stories that came out of people being infected and their marriages broke down because their partners thought it was for other reasons, life's torn apart, a systemic, unprecedented 40-year cover-up. That was Andy Smith, who was at the victims' press conference. It was an incredibly emotional press conference, a deliberate destruction of records. That's another thing. It was a total and utter cover-up. It took so long to get to this point. But as you see it, most people involved seem satisfied isn't the word, as you said, but it's a resolution of sorts that will help them to move forward.
Well, exactly. And this is all as a result of that report that came out in earlier this year. I mean, normally when you see a report of this kind, looking back at a scandal that's gone on so long, that, there'll be a bit of hedge hopping. It's not, it's normally not quite that clear cut. There'll be some sort of excuses from the governments involved. This one was blistering in its criticism of institution after institution, government after government, who allowed this to going on being covered up, because so much of this scandal comes from the fact that it went on for such a long time, and that for such a long time the victims after that weren't able to claim any sort of compensation, even though their lives had been ruined, and in lots of cases they weren't able to work at all. So just the sheer scale and the length of time that it took for anything to be done about this crisis has made it so much worse than it was in the first place. And the report also made clear that almost all of the deaths which have happened, those 3,000 deaths which have happened, they were all pretty much avoidable.
Yeah, and it's worth just reading out a quick bit again of the impact statement from the victims' press conference, which is incredibly moving. Andy Smith and Claire Walton said this: "We've been gaslit for generations. This report finally today puts that to bed. This can never happen again. The civil service closed ranks. We need systemic change. People have lost decades of their lives campaigning, and that's added to the trauma. I sit here, one of 27,000 victims who've been infected. Behind every one of us sits a family." And Olivia Utley today, perhaps they'll find some resolution and peace. Now, thank you very much. It's been revealed that victims of the infected blood scandal will receive support scheme payments for life as part of changes to the multi-billion-pound compensation plan. I'm joined now by infected blood scandal victim Sue Wathen. Sue, welcome to the show. It's always an absolute pleasure to speak to you on the day, of course, that historic day of the resolution. You joined me in the studio here and you shared your story. For those who haven't heard your story, Sue, would you mind sharing with us, please, what happened to you?
Well, I was given infected blood, possibly by a blood transfusion, sometime in the 70s or 80s. I'm not sure which, because my medical notes have been redacted or have disappeared. I know that I didn't find out. Having suffered many years of ill health, I didn't find out until 2014.
And so
in that time, I just had so many years of terrible illness.
And the bottom line is, so you had no idea what was wrong with you. You were suffering from ill health for a long, long time. How and when did you finally find out, and what did that news do to you?
I found out in 2014. And it was as a result of a meeting with a doctor I hadn't seen before at a clinic I'd never been to, who just happened to ask me, had I had any blood transfusions pre-1991? We now know that was a little bit of a spurious date for cut-off purposes. But also, he asked me that. I said yes. He asked if he could test me for hepatitis A, B, C, HIV and VCJD, which I said yes, not thinking for one moment that any of that would come back as positive, but it did. So I was given hepatitis C.
And Sue, then you you got involved in the campaign for resolution. Of course, the report, the inquiry was published back in May, and that was an historic moment. Today, we've got some more details about the payment schemes and the plans. Can I get your take on if you think this is an effective and adequate resolution?
I don't know that resolution is the word. I think we're a long way along the road because so many people have been affected. Obviously, not just the infected, but those affected by this. People who've lost children, people who've lost partners, and so many people have been affected as well. So I think we're a long way along the road. And I think today's news is very welcome. And as I think all of us have said all along, this has been about finding the truth and not just about money.